When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the Red Army faced a crisis. Factories were still relocating east, equipment was scarce, and supplies were desperately needed. Britain and the United States stepped in with a promise to keep the Soviet Union alive through the Lend-Lease program. But delivering those supplies required sailing through one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean on Earth, the Arctic. The Arctic convoys became a lifeline, carrying tanks, aircraft, fuel, food, ammunition, and machines essential for Soviet survival. Without these shipments, the Red Army's ability to resist, especially during the crucial battles of 1941–42, would have been severely weakened. But this lifeline came with a cost. The route passed through waters patrolled by German U-boats, shadowed by Luftwaffe bombers, and threatened by powerful warships based in Norway. On top of that, the convoys faced nature's own brutality. Freezing storms, towering waves, and temperatures so low that steel became brittle and men risked death within minutes in the water. Despite this, the convoys kept sailing. They delivered over 4 million tons of supplies, helping the Soviets hold the line at Moscow, survive Stalingrad, and eventually push westward toward Berlin. The Arctic convoys mattered because they were more than shipments. They were a symbol of Allied determination. They kept the Soviet front alive and ensured that Hitler faced a war on two unforgiving fronts. In the frozen darkness of the Arctic, the fate of the Eastern Front was being carried on the decks of merchant ships. When the Soviet Union was pushed to the brink in the summer of 1941, Britain knew it had to act fast. The Allies needed a way to deliver supplies to the USSR, and quickly. Thus began the planning for the first Arctic convoy, codenamed Operation Dervish. This was uncharted territory. The route to northern Russia was among the harshest on Earth. Freezing winds, unpredictable storms, drifting ice fields, and almost no daylight as winter approached. The Royal Navy had never attempted anything like it, but the stakes were too high to hesitate. Planners gathered intelligence on German forces in Norway, mapped U-boat patrol zones, and calculated the safest path across the Barents Sea. They also needed to ensure secrecy. If Germany discovered what the Allies were planning, the first convoy could be destroyed before it ever reached Soviet waters. Operation Dervish set sail on August 21, 1941 from Iceland. The convoy consisted of 6 merchant ships, escorted by Royal Navy warships and shadowed by distant aircraft. The cargo was modest compared to what would come later – aircraft parts, military stores, raw materials, but symbolically it was enormous. When the convoy reached Arkhangelsk safely on August 31st, it marked the beginning of a partnership that would shape the rest of the war. Soviet workers unloaded the ships under watchful eyes, while British sailors stepped onto Russian soil for the first time in the conflict. Operation Dervish proved that the Arctic route was possible. Dangerous, yes, but survivable. And from that moment onward, the convoys would grow in size, importance, and danger, becoming one of the most perilous supply operations of World War II.
The Arctic route to the Soviet Union quickly earned a terrifying reputation. It wasn't just dangerous, it became known as the deadliest supply line of World War II. Every convoy that sailed through these frozen waters risked destruction from both the enemy and the environment. The route stretched from Britain and Iceland to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, cutting across the top of the world. The ships had to pass through the Norwegian Sea and the Barents Sea, areas dominated by German bases, U-boats, bombers, and battleships. It was a gauntlet lined with steel and fire. But the real killer was nature. Temperatures dropped to nearly -40 degrees Celsius. Storm waves towered higher than houses. Ice coated every rope, railing, and weapon, turning decks into frozen traps. Sailors often worked in darkness for days on end during the polar night, unable to see enemy aircraft until they were almost on top of them. The Arctic route also offered almost no cover, no islands to hide behind, no friendly ports, no room for evasive maneuvers. If a convoy was discovered, it was pinned in the open, a moving target in an empty, endless sheet of ice and water. Hundreds of merchant ships and escort vessels were sunk. Thousands of sailors lost their lives. Entire convoys were wiped out in single attacks, and the fear of freezing in the ocean, dying within minutes, haunted every man on these ships. Yet, the convoys kept sailing. Despite the odds, they delivered critical supplies that helped keep the Soviet Union in the fight. The Arctic route was deadly, but it was essential, a narrow, icy lifeline that helped shape the outcome of the Second World War.
Life aboard an Arctic convoy ship was a battle long before the enemy appeared. Sailors entered a world defined by fear, cold, and chaos, where every hour could bring disaster. The cold was the first enemy. Temperatures plunged so low that metal burned bare skin. Ice coated everything, the deck, the ropes, even the clothes sailors wore. Men chipped ice for hours just to keep the ship from becoming top-heavy and capsizing. Every movement was slow, painful, and dangerous. Inside the ships, conditions were barely better. Cabins were cramped, food was often frozen, and the sound of the engines vibrated through every wall. Sleep was a luxury. Most nights were spent in short, anxious bursts, interrupted by alarms or sudden explosions in the distance. Then there was the fear, a constant companion. U-boats could be lurking below, ready to unleash torpedoes that would send a ship to the bottom in seconds. German aircraft could swoop in without warning, dropping bombs through snow and fog. And somewhere out there, battleships like the Tirpitz were waiting for an opportunity to strike. Chaos erupted whenever danger appeared. Sailors scrambled across icy decks, manned guns with frozen hands, and tried to pick out enemy shapes in the snow-filled sky. Communication was difficult, the weather unpredictable, and mistakes were deadly. Worst of all was the knowledge of what happened if a ship went down. The water was so cold that a man could survive only a few minutes before hypothermia ended his chances. Many sailors carried that fear with them every second of the journey. But despite it all, they endured. Day after day, convoy after convoy, these sailors braved one of the harshest environments on Earth to deliver supplies that kept the Soviet Union fighting. Their resilience turned the Arctic convoys into one of the most courageous chapters of the war at sea.
Beneath the freezing waves of the Arctic Ocean, an invisible enemy stalked the convoys. German U-boats, the feared Wolfpacks, were waiting under the ice, ready to strike at any moment. For the sailors above, the thought of these silent killers was a constant nightmare. The U-boats operated in coordinated groups, spreading out across likely convoy routes and communicating with one another to trap their prey. Once a convoy was detected, the Wolfpack closed in from multiple angles, launching torpedoes from the darkness below. The attacks could come at any time, in fog, during storms, or in the blackness of the polar night, where visibility was nearly zero. The Arctic made the U-boats even more dangerous. Rough seas masked their movements. Icy temperatures made sonar less reliable. And the open expanse of the route left convoys with few places to hide, nowhere to escape, nowhere to maneuver. A single U-boat could wipe out several ships in minutes. The sound of a torpedo strike, A deep, terrible thud, followed by the cracking of steel, was enough to send panic through an entire convoy. Men scrambled to battle stations, destroyers raced to drop depth charges, and merchant ships tried desperately to zigzag through the frozen sea. The Germans knew that sinking these convoys could cripple the Soviet Union's ability to resist. Every torpedo fired wasn't just an attack on a ship, it was an attempt to sever the lifeline, keeping the Red Army supplied. Yet, even in these deadly waters, the Wolfpacks met fierce resistance. Escorting destroyers hunted them relentlessly, and Allied codebreakers worked to intercept their movements. Still, the U-boats remained a deadly threat for the entire campaign, lurking beneath the ice, waiting for their chance to strike.
For the Arctic convoys, danger didn't just come from below the waves, it also came screaming out of the frozen skies. The Luftwaffe, operating from bases along the Norwegian coast, launched relentless air raids on the ships struggling through the icy seas. These German aircraft, bombers, torpedo planes, and reconnaissance scouts used the rugged Norwegian fords as natural fortresses. From there, they could take off quickly, fly low over the Arctic waters, and strike without warning. The convoys often spotted them too late, if at all. Snowstorms, blinding sun glare, and swirling mist made the sky a chaotic battleground. When the attacks came, they were sudden and terrifying. Bombers dove through clouds at high speed, their engines echoing off the frozen waves. Torpedo planes skimmed low across the water, their weapons aimed at the heart of the convoy. Merchant ships, already struggling with ice on their decks, had to twist violently through the sea to avoid deadly hits. The cold only made everything worse. Anti-aircraft gunners' hands froze to metal triggers, machinery jammed from ice buildup. Visibility changed by the minute. A clear sky could turn into a whiteout in moments, hiding threats until they were right overhead. The Luftwaffe's goal was simple: smash the convoys before they reached the Soviet Union. Every ship sunk meant fewer tanks, fewer planes, fewer supplies for the Red Army, and every attack chipped away at Allied morale. Yet the convoys fought back. Escort ships laid down walls of anti-aircraft fire. Allied fighters, when available, braved the cold to defend the fleet. And the crews learned to read the skies, spotting threats even through the blinding Arctic haze.
While U-boats lurked below and the Luftwaffe attacked from above, another threat haunted the Arctic convoys, one so powerful that its mere presence could change an entire operation. This was the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, whose battleships and heavy cruisers stalked the convoy routes from their bases in Norway. The most feared of them all was the Tirpitz, sister ship to the Bismarck. Armed to the teeth, heavily armored, and nearly impossible to sink, the Tirpitz was a floating nightmare for the convoy commanders. It didn't even need to fire a shot. The possibility that it might leave its fjord was enough to force the Royal Navy to commit massive resources to protecting the supply lines. Alongside the Tirpitz were ships like the Admiral Scheer, the Lutzow, and the heavy cruiser Hipper. These vessels patrolled the North Sea and Norwegian coast, waiting for opportunities to pounce. If even one of these ships intercepted a convoy, the result could be catastrophic. A single German warship had enough firepower to annihilate merchant ships and escorts within minutes. The Arctic convoys sailed under the constant shadow of these predators. British intelligence tracked every movement in the fjords. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed them daily. Admirals had to plan each convoy as though a sudden breakout could happen at any moment. When German warships did emerge, chaos followed. Convoys scattered in panic. Escort ships raced to engage hopelessly superior foes. Battles raged in blizzards and darkness. Even the rumor of a surface attack could trigger disastrous decisions, as happened during the infamous PQ-17 disaster. The Kriegsmarine's power in Norway forced the Allies to fight the Arctic War on a razor's edge, balancing aggression with caution, speed with secrecy.
The battleships didn't have to sink every convoy, they only had to threaten them to strike fear into the hearts of sailors and commanders alike. The result was a campaign of constant pressure, suspense, and danger, a deadly game of cat and mouse played across the frozen top of the world.
Few ships in naval history inspired as much fear as the German battleship Tirpitz. Though it spent most of the war hidden in Norwegian fjords, its very existence cast a long, dark shadow over the Arctic convoys. To the Allies, the Tirpitz wasn't just a ship. It was a constant, looming threat that could turn any convoy into a massacre. The Tirpitz was enormous, heavily armored, and armed with 15-inch guns capable of tearing a convoy apart in minutes. If it ever chose to break out into the open sea, it could obliterate every merchant ship and escort in its path. And because of that possibility, every convoy commander had to assume the worst. The ship barely moved, yet it forced the Royal Navy to tie down entire fleets. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers, just to watch it. Every time reconnaissance reported strange activity near the fjords, alarms went out, plans changed, and convoys braced for disaster. Even rumors of Tirpitz stirring from its hiding place could sow panic across the Arctic. From its bases in places like Kafjord, the Tirpitz was protected by mountains, anti-aircraft guns, smoke generators, and torpedo nets. It became a floating fortress, seemingly untouchable. The British launched repeated air attacks and daring commando operations just to damage it, because as long as the Tirpitz existed, the convoys would never be safe. The fear of that ship shaped strategy, slowed operations, and led to some of the worst Allied decisions of the convoy war, none more tragic than the scattering of PQ-17, a disaster triggered by the belief that Tirpitz was coming. In the end, the Tirpitz fired almost no shots at the convoys, but it didn't have to. Its presence alone forced the Allies to fight the Arctic War under constant pressure. The shadow of the Tirpitz was a weapon in itself, haunting every sailor who dared cross the frozen seas to Russia.
Convoy PQ-17 has become one of the most infamous tragedies in naval history, a deadly combination of fear, miscommunication, and catastrophic decision-making. It began in June 1942, when 35 merchant ships set out across the Arctic carrying desperately needed supplies for the Soviet Union. They were heavily escorted, confident, and well-organized, but within days, everything would fall apart. British intelligence reported that the German battleship Tirpitz might be preparing to attack. The possibility alone was enough to send shockwaves through the Admiralty. The Tirpitz had never attacked a convoy before, yet its reputation was so terrifying that commanders feared a massacre was imminent. Then came the fatal moment. Believing the Tirpitz was on the move, the First Sea Lord issued one of the most disastrous orders of the war. Convoy is to scatter. In an instant, cohesion vanished. The escort warships withdrew to face the supposed threat, leaving helpless merchant ships alone in the open Arctic. Without protection, each ship became an easy target for U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers. The destruction was swift and merciless. One by one, ships were torpedoed, bombed, or shelled. Some were caught in relentless air attacks. Others were hunted down by submarines. The icy water claimed many sailors long before rescue could arrive. The polar sea turned into a graveyard. By the time the survivors limped into Soviet ports, only 11 of the original 35 merchant ships had made it. It was the worst loss in the history of the Arctic convoys, a disaster not caused by the Tirpitz itself, but by the fear of the Tirpitz. PQ-17 became a harsh lesson in the dangers of panic, poor intelligence, and the psychological power of a single enemy warship. And for the men who lived through it, the memory of that order
Scatter would haunt them for the rest of their lives.
For sailors on the Arctic convoys, the sea itself was as deadly as any enemy. The frigid waters, towering waves, and ice-laden decks made every voyage a fight for survival, long before a torpedo or bomb appeared. Freezing temperatures turned steel decks into slippery death traps. Ice built up on railings, ropes, and gun mounts, weighing down ships and threatening to tip them in high seas. Crew members had to chip away at ice constantly just to prevent their vessels from capsizing. Exposure meant frostbite within minutes, and hypothermia could claim a man faster than German guns. The storms were legendary. Waves towered above the ships, battering hulls, smashing lifeboats, and throwing cargo overboard. Visibility could drop to near zero as snow and sleet swept across the decks. Sailors had to cling to anything they could find, bracing against wind gusts that could knock a man into the icy sea. The Arctic night compounded the danger. During polar night, darkness stretched for 24 hours, masking both threats and obstacles. Crew members had to navigate ice fields, floating debris, and sudden storms without any reliable reference points. One wrong move could mean death. Nature didn't spare anyone. Convoys were slowed, ships were damaged, and morale sank under the constant assault of cold, wind, and waves. Yet, despite these brutal conditions, the convoys sailed on. They delivered tanks, trucks, ammunition, and hope to the Soviet Union, all while fighting a relentless, invisible enemy that came from the sky, sea, and ice alike. In the Arctic, nature itself was a combatant, and survival required courage, skill, and sheer stubborn determination.
The Arctic convoys faced not only ice, storms, and enemy attacks, they also battled the extremes of daylight and darkness. The region's unique climate created conditions unlike anywhere else in the world, where the sun could either never set or never rise. During the midnight sun of summer, convoys sailed under constant daylight. While this made navigation easier, it also left ships fully exposed to German reconnaissance aircraft and U-boat patrols. Enemy pilots could spot convoys from miles away, and U-boats could shadow them without fear of darkness hiding their movements. There was no safe cover, and even at midnight, the Arctic sun shone relentlessly on every deck. Conversely, during the polar night, the world plunged into complete darkness for weeks. Sailors had to navigate frozen seas, avoid drifting ice, and watch for enemy attacks with barely any visibility. Storms, snow, and fog could make the night even more disorienting. Anti-aircraft gunners and lookouts struggled to spot aircraft or torpedoes until they were almost on top of the convoy. Both extremes tested human endurance. Crew members became disoriented, sleep-deprived, and exhausted, while the constant shifts in light added a psychological strain. Ships could run aground, collide, or miss crucial maneuvers simply because of the unnatural rhythm of day and night. The Arctic's 24-hour extremes turned every voyage into a test of skill, vigilance, and nerve. Sailors had to fight not just the enemy and the elements, but the very clock of nature itself, where the sun could either betray them or hide them in equal measure.
In the frozen expanse of the Arctic, technology became as vital as courage. The seas were treacherous, enemy attacks frequent, and visibility often near zero. For the Allied convoys, radar and sonar were life-saving tools that could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Radar allowed escort ships to detect incoming aircraft over the snow-covered waters, even in blizzards or the darkness of the polar night. Early warning systems gave crews precious seconds to man anti-aircraft guns, alter course, or prepare for evasive maneuvers. Without radar, a Luftwaffe strike could hit a convoy completely unprepared. Sonar, meanwhile, became the Allies' eyes beneath the ice-cold waves. U-boats prowled the Arctic like silent predators, and sonar enabled escort ships to detect them before they fired torpedoes. Depth charges could then be launched to drive submarines away or destroy them outright. Each ping of sonar represented a small but vital advantage in a deadly environment.
No convoy could survive the Arctic without its protectors, the escort destroyers and corvettes that formed a moving shield around the merchant ships. These warships were small but deadly, tasked with fending off U-boats, enemy aircraft, and surface raiders while battling the brutal Arctic seas. Destroyers were the convoy's heavy hitters. Fast and maneuverable, they could chase down submarines, launch depth charges, and provide anti-aircraft fire. Corvettes, smaller but equally vital, patrolled the flanks, scanning for torpedoes and guiding the convoy through ice-filled waters. Together, they formed a protective cordon, absorbing the first blows and keeping the merchantmen relatively safe. Life on these ships was relentless. Crews worked around the clock, manning guns in freezing temperatures, scanning the horizon for U-boats or bombers, and navigating treacherous waves. Ice built up quickly, weighing down the decks and threatening the ship's stability. Every decision could be a matter of life or death. The escorts also faced immense psychological pressure. They knew that if they failed, the convoy could be annihilated. Yet they maintained discipline, constantly adjusting formations, coordinating sonar sweeps, and responding to enemy attacks with precision and speed. Without these escorts, the Arctic convoys would have been easy prey. It was their courage, skill, and determination that turned the Arctic from a death trap into a survivable, though still perilous, route, giving the merchant crews the chance to deliver vital supplies to the Soviet Union.
The Arctic convoy's journey didn't end when they reached Soviet waters. The ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk were vital gateways for supplies, but they were also under constant threat from the Luftwaffe and German naval forces. Every ship that made it through the Arctic ice faced another battlefield before it could unload its cargo. Murmansk, ice-free year-round, was a lifeline for the Red Army, but it was also exposed. German bombers attacked repeatedly, destroying warehouses, rail lines, and even some ships docked at the quays. Civilians and military personnel worked tirelessly to unload supplies under the threat of bombs, knowing that every delay could cost lives at the front. Arkhangelsk, farther east, offered some protection from German aircraft, but convoys had to traverse even longer stretches of icy sea to reach it. Winter storms and icebergs made navigation treacherous, and German U-boats still patrolled the waters. Docking and unloading supplies was slow, exhausting work, often done in darkness and freezing temperatures. Despite the danger, the Soviet ports functioned as the crucial link between the convoys and the front lines. Railways, roads, and storage facilities quickly moved the cargo inland, turning raw materials, tanks, and ammunition into combat power for the Red Army. The constant pressure on Murmansk and Arkhangelsk showed that the Arctic convoys were not just a test of naval skill, they were a war within a war, fought on frozen docks, under enemy fire, and in a climate that was as deadly as the battlefield itself. These ports kept the lifeline alive, ensuring that supplies reached the men who needed them most.
The Arctic convoys were more than a supply operation. They were a test of Allied cooperation under extreme conditions. Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union had to work together despite differences in strategy,
language, and priorities, all while facing the harshest environment imaginable. The British Royal Navy provided escort ships, destroyers, and corvettes, along with experience in naval operations. They coordinated convoy routes, tracked U-boat positions, and defended merchant vessels from air and sea attacks. American forces contributed merchant ships, escorts, and logistical support, helping to sustain the convoy's increasing scale as the war progressed. On the Soviet side, ports in Murmansk and Arkhangelsk had to receive, unload, and distribute supplies under constant bombardment in freezing temperatures. Soviet workers, soldiers, and engineers ensured that the cargo reached the front lines quickly, maintaining the lifeline that kept their army fighting. Coordination was difficult. Convoys had to navigate extreme weather, the threat of German warships, and shifting ice fields, all while maintaining communication across three nations with different military doctrines. But the shared goal of defeating Hitler kept the alliance focused. This cooperation ensured that millions of tons of vital supplies reached the Red Army, bolstering Soviet resistance at crucial moments such as the defense of Moscow and the Battle of Stalingrad. The Arctic convoys proved that even in the deadliest seas, joint effort, trust, and coordination could overcome both nature and the enemy.
Convoy JW-51B, sailing in December 1942, became a defining moment in the Arctic Convoy campaign. Unlike many convoys that suffered heavy losses, JW-51B would go down in history as a rare victory against the odds, one that infuriated Adolf Hitler himself. The convoy, consisting of 14 merchant ships, was escorted by a mix of British cruisers, destroyers, and smaller vessels. German forces, including Admiral Hipper's heavy cruiser and supporting destroyers, attempted to intercept the convoy, hoping to deliver a crushing blow and disrupt the supply line to the Soviet Union. What followed was a tense, chaotic naval engagement in icy, storm-lashed seas. British escorts used skill, coordination, and bold tactics to protect the merchant ships. Through aggressive maneuvers, coordinated gunfire, and a refusal to retreat, the convoy defenders managed to repel the German attack, sinking one destroyer and forcing the heavier ships to withdraw. The success of JW-51B was remarkable, not only because of the conditions, but because it proved that German surface raiders could be stopped in the Arctic. For Hitler, who expected the convoys to be easy prey, the battle was an embarrassment. Orders were issued for even heavier patrols, but the Royal Navy had demonstrated that skill and courage could beat raw firepower in the frozen north. JW-51B became a symbol of Allied resilience, morale, and tactical ingenuity. It showed that despite ice, storms, U-boats, and Luftwaffe attacks, convoys could survive and even triumph, keeping vital supplies flowing to the Soviet front.
The Battle of the Barents Sea, fought on December 31, 1942, marked a dramatic turning point in the Arctic Convoy campaign. German surface ships, including the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and several destroyers, attempted to intercept convoy JW-51B and destroy its merchant vessels. But what should have been a German victory turned into a stunning Allied success. The convoy's escort, led by British cruisers and destroyers, faced overwhelming odds. The icy seas, limited visibility, and stormy weather created a battlefield as deadly as any enemy gun. Despite being outgunned, the escorts used coordinated maneuvers, aggressive counterattacks, and skillful use of the Arctic terrain to protect the convoy. During the battle, British ships engaged the German heavy cruiser and destroyers, drawing fire away from the merchant vessels. One German destroyer was sunk, and the Admiral Hipper was forced to retreat. Remarkably, all convoy ships survived, delivering their crucial supplies to the Soviet Union. The outcome enraged Hitler, who had expected an easy victory. In frustration, he considered scrapping the German surface fleet and relying entirely on U-boats, a decision that significantly altered the course of the naval war. The Battle of the Barents Sea proved that well-led and courageous escorts could defeat a superior force, even in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. It also bolstered Allied morale, strengthened the Arctic Convoy system, and ensured that vital Lend-Lease supplies continued to reach the Soviet front.
While the Arctic convoys faced freezing seas, deadly storms, and relentless enemy attacks, another battle was being fought in the shadows, the War of Intelligence. Allied codebreakers, working tirelessly at Bletchley Park and other locations, were turning German secrets into life-saving knowledge. The German Navy relied on Enigma machines to encrypt orders for U-boats, surface raiders, and Luftwaffe units patrolling the Arctic. Without understanding these messages, Allied commanders had to navigate blind through treacherous waters. Convoys could be ambushed, scattered, or destroyed before they even realized they were in danger. Thanks to brilliant cryptographers, the Allies were able to decrypt critical German communications, predicting U-boat patrol patterns, spotting planned attacks, and adjusting convoy routes accordingly. Every intercepted message could save lives, prevent losses, and keep the supply line to the Red Army intact. The intelligence war also extended to decoding Luftwaffe movements. Convoy commanders received early warnings of bomber raids, allowing escorts to prepare anti-aircraft defenses and adjust formations. Even the timing of convoys was influenced by decrypted messages, avoiding potential traps in the frozen seas. Without the work of these codebreakers, the Arctic convoys would have faced even higher losses. Their behind-the-scenes efforts proved that information could be as deadly as a torpedo, turning the tide in favor of the Allies and ensuring that thousands of tons of vital supplies reached the Red Army. The Battle of the Arctic was not only fought on decks and in icy waters, it was also fought in the quiet rooms of mathematicians and cryptographers whose work saved countless lives. Amidst the Arctic convoy's chaos and danger, one group of men stood quietly heroic, the merchant navy sailors. These civilians were tasked with carrying the lifeline to the Soviet Union, sailing unarmed cargo ships through one of the deadliest theaters of war. Unlike military personnel, many merchant sailors had no formal combat training. They faced U-boats, Luftwaffe attacks, freezing seas, and towering waves, relying on courage and quick thinking to survive. Yet every voyage mattered. Tanks, ammunition, trucks, food, and medical supplies depended on their skill and perseverance. Life aboard these ships was grueling. Decks iced over, storms battered the hull, and sleeping in cramped, freezing cabins was the norm. The constant threat of torpedoes or bombs made every moment tense. If a ship sank, sailors risked death within minutes in icy waters where hypothermia claimed lives almost instantly. Despite these hazards, merchant navy crews carried on. They navigated dangerous waters, maintained their ships in freezing conditions, and worked alongside escort vessels to deliver critical supplies to Soviet ports. Many received medals and commendations after the war, but for most, the work was done quietly, without fanfare, in the shadow of the Royal Navy and the Red Army. The courage of these civilians turned ordinary merchant vessels into lifelines of survival, proving that heroism does not always wear a uniform. In the Arctic, their bravery saved lives, upheld alliances,
and kept the Eastern Front supplied under impossible odds.
Beneath the icy surface of the Arctic Ocean, German submarines prowled like predators. Their mission? To sink the convoys carrying vital supplies to the Soviet Union. These U-boats were stealthy, deadly, and adapted to the frozen waters in ways that made the Arctic route one of the most dangerous supply lines of the war. U-boats often operated in wolfpacks, coordinating attacks on convoys to overwhelm escorts and isolate merchant ships. They used intelligence from reconnaissance aircraft and intercepted radio communications to predict convoy movements. Ice and storms sometimes worked in their favor, masking their approach and hiding their presence until torpedoes were already in the water. Torpedoes under the Arctic ice were especially lethal. Cold water increased their stability and range, but rough seas and floating ice could deflect or damage them. Submarine commanders had to calculate angles precisely, often firing from beneath layers of sea ice where detection was nearly impossible. Every successful strike could destroy a merchant ship and leave hundreds of sailors fighting the freezing sea. The U-boats also used psychological warfare. The constant threat of unseen torpedoes kept convoy crews on edge, forcing them to maneuver constantly and making coordination difficult. Even if no torpedoes hit, the tension wore down morale and exhausted sailors already battling storms and cold. Yet, despite these dangers, Allied convoys learned to adapt. Escort destroyers, corvettes, and sonar-equipped vessels countered U-boat attacks, and careful routing helped reduce losses. Still, the presence of German submarines lurking beneath the Arctic ice was a constant, invisible menace, proving that the ocean itself could be as deadly as any enemy gun.
In the Arctic, weather could be as deadly as German torpedoes or Luftwaffe bombers. Convoy commanders quickly learned that knowledge of the storms and ice conditions could mean the difference between survival and disaster. That's where weather ships came in, small, specialized vessels tasked with monitoring the Arctic environment and guiding convoys through the frozen seas. These ships measured temperature, wind, ice drift, and storm patterns, sending critical information back to convoy planners. Accurate forecasts allowed commanders to alter routes, delay departures, or adjust formations to minimize risk. Without these reports, a convoy could be caught in a sudden blizzard, smashed against ice fields, or scattered in near-zero visibility. Life aboard a weather ship was harsh. Crews endured freezing decks, towering waves, and ice accumulation, often with minimal protection. They were among the first to spot dangerous conditions, and their reports directly influenced the fate of dozens of merchant ships and their escorts. The work of weather ships also helped coordinate air reconnaissance. Knowing where clouds, snow, or fog would appear allowed Allied aircraft to patrol more effectively, spotting U-boats and enemy warships before they struck. In the unforgiving Arctic, information was a lifeline. Weather ships didn't fire guns or launch torpedoes, but their ability to predict storms and guide convoys through frozen seas made them essential to survival. They turned the deadly Arctic environment from a random threat into a navigable, albeit still dangerous, route for Allied supply efforts.
For the Arctic convoys, the dangers of ice, storms, and enemy attacks were only part of the threat. Hidden beneath the icy waters of the Barents Sea were German naval minefields, silent killers that could destroy a ship without warning. The Germans laid extensive minefields along convoy routes, using mines designed to detonate on contact or via magnetic triggers. Merchant vessels and escort ships alike had to navigate carefully, often relying on incomplete maps and dangerous reconnaissance to avoid catastrophe. One miscalculation could send a ship to the bottom, taking its cargo and crew with it. Mines were particularly terrifying because they were invisible. There were no warning signs, no sound, no movement, just a deadly explosion waiting beneath the waves. Ice, poor visibility, and rough seas made detection even more difficult. Convoys sometimes had to slow to a crawl, trusting their charts and lookout crews to avoid disaster. Escort vessels and minesweepers played a critical role. Using paravanes and other clearing devices, they worked tirelessly to create safe channels, often under the threat of attack from U-boats and aircraft. Even then, the risk remained constant, as mines could drift with currents or be newly laid by German forces. The Barents Sea minefields turned the Arctic into a minefield of tension, skill, and danger, forcing convoy crews to rely on training, courage, and meticulous navigation. Every voyage was a battle against the sea, the enemy, and the invisible killers lurking beneath the ice.
For sailors on the Arctic convoys, falling into the icy waters was almost always a death sentence. The freezing temperatures could claim a life in minutes, and yet, amid storms, attacks, and chaos, Allied crews mounted daring rescue operations to save their comrades. When a ship was torpedoed or bombed, the first priority was often to get men out of the water before hypothermia set in. Crew members on escort destroyers and corvettes risked their own lives, launching small boats or dangling nets and ropes to pull survivors aboard. Every second counted. In waters near minus 30 degrees Celsius, a man could succumb in under 5 minutes. Rescue operations were complicated by rough seas, floating debris, and ongoing enemy attacks. Ships had to maneuver carefully to avoid running over men in the water, while gunners remained vigilant for U-boats or aircraft trying to exploit the chaos. Yet, despite the danger, crews worked tirelessly, often hauling dozens of men from the freezing sea in a single operation. Medical teams treated frostbite, hypothermia, and injuries on deck, often improvising with blankets, heated compartments, and whatever supplies were available. Survival depended on speed, skill, and coordination, a race against both time and the Arctic environment.
For sailors on the Arctic convoys, survival wasn't just a physical battle, it was a psychological one. The freezing seas, relentless storms, and constant threat of enemy attack weighed heavily on every man, creating stress and fear that could be as deadly as torpedoes or bombs. The Arctic Ocean was unforgiving. Freezing temperatures made every task painful and exhausting, while ice-coated decks and equipment increased the risk of injury. Sailors faced the ever-present fear of falling into the icy water, where hypothermia could kill within minutes. Every wave, every gust of wind reminded them how fragile life was in such extreme conditions. The enemy was always close, but often unseen. U-boats prowled beneath the waves, aircraft could strike from the skies, and battleships lurked in fjords. Sailors never knew when danger would appear, forcing them to remain vigilant for hours on end. The constant tension left little room for rest or relief, wearing down nerves and morale. Polar night and the midnight sun added to the strain. Endless darkness or unbroken daylight disrupted sleep cycles and created a sense of disorientation, making the convoys feel even more isolating and claustrophobic. Yet despite these psychological pressures, crews persevered. Training, discipline, camaraderie, and purpose helped sailors endure the Arctic's horrors. They learned to push past fear, focus on their duties, and support one another in an environment where the margin for error was razor thin. The psychological toll of the Arctic convoys serves as a reminder that war isn't only fought with weapons, it is also a battle of the mind, where courage, resilience, and determination can be as vital as firepower.
The Arctic convoys weren't just a perilous journey. They carried the lifeblood of the Soviet war effort. From Britain and America, convoys transported tanks, trucks, fuel, ammunition, and countless other supplies that would help turn the tide against Nazi Germany. Tanks rolled off merchant ships onto icy docks, ready to bolster Red Army units on the front lines. Trucks delivered mobility and logistical support, allowing troops to move quickly across vast battlefields. Fuel, spare parts, and munitions kept machinery running and planes flying. Every crate, barrel, and vehicle was a tangible symbol of hope and determination. The cargo wasn't just material, it was psychological support. The knowledge that the Allies were committed to supplying the Soviet Union strengthened morale among soldiers and civilians alike. Each successful convoy meant that the Red Army could fight another day, that towns and cities could resist occupation, and that Hitler's advance could be stalled or reversed. Handling and delivering this cargo was a monumental challenge. Arctic ports were often under attack. Ships were battered by storms, and crews worked tirelessly to unload supplies in freezing temperatures. Yet, despite the danger, the mission succeeded repeatedly. The Arctic Lend-Lease program demonstrated the power of Allied cooperation and the importance of logistics in modern warfare. Tanks, trucks, fuel, and the hope they represented were delivered across the deadliest supply route in history, keeping the Eastern Front alive and reshaping the outcome of the Second World War.
The Arctic convoys were more than a perilous supply route. They were a lifeline that helped turn the tide on the Eastern Front. By delivering tanks, trucks, ammunition, and other critical supplies, they ensured that the Red Army could resist and eventually push back the German advance. Every convoy that reached Murmansk or Arkhangelsk meant that Soviet forces had the equipment and fuel to hold cities, mount counteroffensives, and sustain prolonged campaigns. These supplies played a crucial role in battles like Moscow, Stalingrad, and Leningrad, where Allied aid kept the Red Army fighting despite staggering losses. The impact went beyond the battlefield. Convoys boosted morale for both Soviet troops and civilians, showing that the Allies were committed to their survival and victory. They also forced Germany to divert resources to the Arctic, protecting supply lines that could have been used elsewhere, and tying down U-boats, aircraft, and naval forces. The courage and endurance of convoy crews, combined with careful planning, escorts, and intelligence support, ensured that millions of tons of vital materiel reached the Soviet Union. Without these convoys, the Eastern Front might have looked very different, potentially allowing Germany to consolidate gains and prolong the war. In the end, the Arctic convoys were more than a logistical operation. They were a symbol of resilience, cooperation, and strategic foresight, demonstrating that even in the deadliest waters on Earth, determination and teamwork could shape the outcome of the war.
By the end of World War II, the Arctic convoys had proven themselves as one of the most remarkable logistical achievements of the conflict. Despite freezing seas, deadly storms, German U-boats, Luftwaffe raids, and lurking surface ships, the convoys persevered, delivering the supplies that kept the Soviet Union in the fight. Victory in the Arctic was not measured in dramatic battles or single heroic feats, but in endurance, resilience, and unyielding determination. Merchant sailors, naval escorts, air reconnaissance crews, and codebreakers all played vital roles, working together to navigate the deadliest supply route in history. By maintaining this lifeline, the Allies ensured that the Red Army had the equipment, fuel, and provisions needed to mount offensives that ultimately pushed German forces back across Eastern Europe. Each convoy that survived reinforced a chain of survival, strategy, and collaboration that contributed directly to the defeat of Nazi Germany. The Arctic campaign also left a legacy. It demonstrated the importance of logistics, Allied cooperation, and adaptability in extreme conditions. The courage and sacrifices of those involved became a testament to human resilience, proving that even in the harshest environments, determination could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. In the end, the Arctic convoys were a victory not only for strategy and supply, but for endurance, bravery, and the unbroken spirit of the sailors and crews who dared the frozen seas.
The men and women who served on the Arctic convoys faced some of the harshest conditions of World War II. Freezing seas, violent storms, relentless enemy attacks, and the constant threat of death defined their service. Yet, despite the dangers, they performed heroically, and many were eventually recognized with medals and honors. Sailors from the Merchant Navy, naval escorts, and air crews were awarded for bravery, endurance, and outstanding service. Decorations such as the Distinguished Service Order, Distinguished Service Cross, and campaign medals acknowledged acts of courage under extreme conditions. Even those who survived unscathed were honored for enduring the relentless Arctic environment while ensuring that vital supplies reached the Soviet Union. Recognition was not only about individual heroism, but also about the collective effort. Entire crews and convoys were commended for their courage, teamwork, and resilience in one of the deadliest theaters of the war. These awards highlighted the critical role the Arctic convoys played in supporting the Eastern Front and the broader Allied war effort. Beyond medals, the legacy of these veterans lives on in memorials, historical accounts, and the enduring respect of nations that benefited from their sacrifices. Their courage and perseverance became a symbol of Allied cooperation and determination in the face of unimaginable odds. The medals and honors awarded to Arctic veterans serve as a reminder that heroism often comes in quiet, relentless acts of endurance, and that those who braved the frozen seas earned a place in history that will never be forgotten.
The Arctic convoys were not only a test of ships and strategy, but of human endurance. For those who survived, the experiences became lasting memories, stories of courage, fear, and sheer determination on one of the deadliest supply routes in history. Survivors often recall freezing temperatures, decks coated in ice, and waves towering above their ships. They speak of torpedo attacks, Luftwaffe raids, and lurking U-boats, but also of the camaraderie that kept them going. Many describe the constant tension and exhaustion, where every moment required vigilance, and every misstep could be fatal. Letters, diaries, and oral histories paint vivid pictures of the Arctic battlefield. Sailors helping each other pull men from icy waters, crews working for hours in storms to save cargo, and the terrifying sight of fellow ships being destroyed just miles away. These personal accounts capture both the tragedy and heroism of the convoys, giving life to what numbers and statistics alone cannot convey. Survivors also speak of the psychological toll, the fear of the unseen enemy, the darkness of the polar night, and the never-ending cold that seemed to penetrate to the bone. Yet, amid hardship, they recount moments of humor, resilience, and determination that sustained them through the ordeal. These testimonies preserve the human side of the Arctic campaign, reminding us that behind every ship and every convoy were real people confronting the frozen battlefield with courage and endurance. They ensure that the sacrifices, hardships, and heroism of the Arctic convoys will never be forgotten.
The Arctic convoys were more than a series of perilous missions. They were a testament to human courage, resilience, and cooperation under some of the harshest conditions of World War II.
Freezing seas, violent storms, and relentless enemy attacks made every voyage a battle against nature and man alike. These convoys ensured that the Soviet Union received vital supplies, tanks, trucks, fuel, ammunition, and medical aid that allowed it to resist and ultimately push back the German advance. Each successful convoy demonstrated that determination and teamwork could overcome nearly impossible odds, and that courage was not just about firepower, but endurance and perseverance. The legacy of the Arctic convoys is also one of Allied cooperation. Britain, America, and the USSR worked together, overcoming logistical challenges, extreme climates, and language barriers to sustain a lifeline that turned the tide on the Eastern Front. Intelligence from codebreakers, bravery from merchant navy crews, and skill from naval escorts all combined to make these operations possible. Beyond strategy and logistics, the convoys left a lasting human legacy. Sailors faced unimaginable danger, yet their heroism, sacrifices, and survival stories inspired generations. Monuments, medals, and historical records commemorate those who risked and often gave their lives on the frozen seas. Ultimately, the Arctic convoys are remembered not just for their tactical or strategic impact, but as a story of courage under impossible odds, a triumph of human spirit that proved resilience and bravery can prevail even in the harshest and deadliest conditions.